The wonders of life got the prettiest side for everyone to enjoy. Standing up close by the Christmas tree.
Welcome to Never Enough Time. Today we are outdoors. It was just 45 days ago that we were doing these in 80 and 90 degree weather at the beach. 45 days later, winter has come to the north. If you got a few minutes, we're going to dive into the Glycine Airman DC-4 Purist. I think this is a compelling watch for many reasons. Not a perfect watch. Let's get into it.
Across the river, there's a woman I know. Sometimes I go there and I knock on her door. I said, baby, 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 let's waste some time.
So if we just break down the watch from a design and spec standpoint, and then we'll talk about how this might fit into your rotation. We have a 42 millimeter by 50 millimeter. Now I get 49.6. The website says 49, but I think we'll go with 50. I think it's 42 by 50. It is 12 millimeters thick to the top of the crystal. If you just do the case though, it's a very slim profile. It's rated about 11 millimeters. So a very thin watch to wear, very wearable, very comfortable in that regards. 22 millimeter lug width. You do have a sapphire crystal. You have a bidirectional rotating bezel, and I have the bezel locked. The crown at 4 o'clock will actually release the bezel for you to set a second time zone, and we'll talk about that in a second. So it just rotates either way on there. 200 meters of water resistance. You have an exhibition case back showing what they call the GL293, which is the ETA 2893. And now we're going to try to be fancy here, right? The decoration on the rotor, what do we say? The Côte de Genève. I love watch terms that make a redneck super uncomfortable. It doesn't matter. Côte de Genève. Côte de Genève. Côte de Genève. Côte. It's decorated, the rotor, and that is really I believe the only modification on this. There might be some other very minor modifications, but basically at a 2893 with a custom rotor, and I actually think quite a handsome looking rotor there. So from a spec standpoint, this watch has a lot. The exhibition case back is mineral glass, not sapphire. Not sure why they didn't do sapphire on both, and maybe they do on some of the newer models. You have 200 meters of water resistance. You have a sapphire crystal. You have a second time zone, the GMT function. You have a date window at 3 o'clock. So from a spec standpoint, this watch has it. Now, if you don't know anything about Glycine, you probably do if you landed on this. But in case you don't, just at a very high level, Glycine was founded in 1914. It is a heritage Swiss brand. About 100 years after that, somewhere in 2016, I believe, it was bought by the Invicta Group. And that's what's caused, I think, some consternation in the watch community. I understand why people might have certain proclivities against wanting to own an Invicta. I've never owned one. I don't really get into I hate this brand, I hate that brand. I really take watches on a case-by-case basis. And I wish I'd found this Glycine earlier. You know, on YouTube, there's a lot of watches that are saturated in terms of review. You could probably start watching tonight and a month later still be watching Rolex reviews. I watch them. I love looking at the watches too. Glycine Airman, there are some reviews out there. It's not a lot. And when you get to specific variations like the DC-4 Purist, I think there's only a handful that have been made recently, which I think is too bad. This watch to me offers a lot. So if we set aside the specs, we have a heritage Swiss brand, but we also have military heritage. This is a watch that was sold to militaries around the world, is my understanding. I believe I saw a video by Teddy Baldessar on watches of Vietnam. The Glycine Airman featured prominently in that video. So you have the Swiss heritage, you have some military inspired, or military heritage as well. And then with the Glycine Airman, you get a watch that 1 year before Rolex brought out the first watch to track multiple time zones. So if you're into the heritage and history side of collecting watches, the Glycine Airman has it. But when we take a closer look at its finishing and its dial and things that, from an aesthetic standpoint, right, we have the crown at 4 o'clock, which locks in the bezel. Now the bezel rotates pretty easily. It locks in tight when you screw it down and set your time zone. I will say though that the bezel, when you're used to a die bezel, like with that ratcheting sound, or that sort of tool-like feeling, this doesn't have it. It basically just slides around. It's not unpleasant, but you're not going to own this watch for the bezel action. You're going to pick your time zone. You're going to lock it in. I would also say that the bezel actually, it's pretty thin. And so it has, I don't want to say a cheap feeling. It just doesn't have a robust tool watch like feel. And I may be over exaggerating that because it's not a bezel, again, that you are meant to always be turning or fidgeting with or ratcheting sound. It's pick your time zone, lock in that 4 o'clock crown, and be good with it. The dial, though, to me is the winner here, and just the overall vintage vibe that this watch gives off. It has all the vintage charm you would want. The Arabic numerals are not white. They're not that peachy. They're that yellowish vintage look. The Dauphine hands, I think, were a great choice for this. You have the DC-4 down there, a reference to the airplane that the Glycine executive was on when he talked to the pilots about creating a watch with multiple time zones. It was a DC-4, so that's what you have there right above the, normally you'd say 6 o'clock. This is right above the noon. Noon is at the 12 there. You have the simple Glycine Airman under the 24-hour, AM to indicate day hours, PM, evening hours on this side. You have a cyclops window at the, you would typically say 3. This is at the 6 o'clock, and it has red, a white date wheel in red. Now, typically I like my date wheels to match the dial. This is just pretty unusual. It's not unusual that it's a white date wheel against the black. A lot of watch models have that. That's very, very common. The fact that they used red, and the red is nowhere else anywhere on the dial or with the watch, at first I thought, don't know, but actually I quite like it. And I liken it to other watches where they put maybe a orange second hand, or the Oris Big Crown Pro Pilot puts a red tip at the arrow of the second hand. So that little bit of color that adds some visual interest. But I will say this 42 millimeter dial packs a tremendous amount of information on the dial, I think, without looking cluttered. It's very clean. The printing is very sharp. The whole design and layout of having the even numbers be larger, the odd numbers be smaller, I think aids to the legibility. Sometimes it's a little difficult to get an exact minute because your eyes are looking at a 20 instead of a 10. And, so they have the 50 out there, but getting adjusted to the 24-hour dial is probably the trickiest part. So I think here you have a watch that I have fallen in love with. Poetically speaking, there's two things about this watch that are unique for me. One is the 24-hour dial. I wear this watch every day, and it reminds me I have one rotation to make the day great. I love that. I don't know if it's nostalgia or romance or poetry of owning a watch, but when I look down on this, I can see exactly how much of my day is left, mentally knowing what I still need to get done and what I need to accomplish. I love that in this watch. I love its tool-like aesthetic. The bezel isn't something to be rotating like I mentioned, but it still has the look of a functional tool watch, and it is. I have this set to Tokyo time zone. So Kanishiro, if you're watching, I just keep track of what time zone in your neck of the world. So I like that. This also was purchased secondhand. I bought this from its original owner, and that's typically what I do when I buy secondhand watches that I plan or anticipate keeping in my collection. I like to buy them from the original owner. I bought it from a U.S. Marine Corps fighter pilot who used it on 2 deployments. To have a watch that was actually used for its intended purposes. It's a pilot's watch used by a pilot in his deployment and in his missions. I love that piece of it. The lume on the watch, it's not good. I shouldn't say it's not good. It's not great. It's okay. If the watch is, you've been outside during the day and you head into the movie theater, you'll be able to see it. And I'll roll in some lume shots. It just does not last very long because the numerals are printed. They don't have a very thick application of the lume. Now the lume on the hands lasts quite a while, but not on the dial itself. So if we cut it off there, the pros of this watch: heritage, value. This watch I got secondhand for about $600. The Glycine watches like the Airman and the Combat Sub and some of those can be all over the map. And I assume part of that is older stock that was being liquidated from the pre-Invicta days. And there's probably a ton of those and they're still out there. I've had a hard time finding the DC-4 Purist. That's the variant that I wanted. That took me some time to find. Brand new. I know on some websites they're currently sold out. They were just under $900. But I think you can get them secondhand for between $600 and $800. And I think that represents a lot of value. It's a workhorse at a movement tracking multiple time zones. I think also this watch has all the vintage charm that you would want in a watch without being too cheeky or too not cheap feeling, but you know what I mean. Sometimes they try too hard to be vintage. I think this strikes that right balance with the hand choice and the color choice for the Arabics on the dial. An absolutely spectacularly simple, functional, well laid out, legible dial. On the con side, the bezel is a weird feeling bezel when you're used to dive watches. And I don't know if that's a knock, but if you're used to grabbing the bezel, feeling that sort of chunky, tactile feeling, that's not this one. It's feels like a very thin piece of metal that you slide around to the spot and then kind of lock it in. And then lastly, the 24-hour dial takes some getting used to. That's not a easy thing to simply just look at and go, oh. But I counterbalance that with the idea that I get one rotation around the dial. So everyday piece, absolutely. And it's no coincidence that some of my very favorite everyday watches are pilot watches. The Oris Big Crown Pro Pilot, the Zen 104, now this Glycine Airman. And the Glycine Airman is not in the category of Oris or Zen in terms of its finishing. The polishing on this watch is adequate. When you look at a Zen and the angles and the chamfered edges and the unique case design, Oris does some nice work with their coin edge machining around the fixed bezel. That kind of finesse is not in this watch. This is sort of an old school, basic watch case tool watch. That's fine by me. That's a good everyday. What you get in exchange for some of that is more cash in your pocket. This watch, again, is going to be half as much of an Oris and probably even 40% of a Zen. And so you have to make those calls. Would you rather have $1,000 in your pocket and a Glycine or the Oris, or the Zen or the Oris? If you don't like a 24-hour dial and you don't want to mess with it, right? They have a 12-hour one as well that will make 2 rotations around, and they add a 4th hand for the GMT, and then you can track 3 time zones. But I preferred this one. I really, really enjoy it. It isn't for everyone. You have to accept, some of those things that I mentioned in terms of it's kind of a basic looking watch, but for an everyday watch, for a tool watch, I do really appreciate that. So we'll cut that off there. Thank you for hanging out. Thanks for hanging out outside. I like being out here to do these reviews. We got more coming up very shortly. Until next time, God bless.